Direct hit. Tsura. Blacked out Berlin her backdrop, binoculars in her hand, Tsura stood beneath a blanket of warplanes. Each screeching bomb and blast became a small revenge for Kizzy. Revenge for Doer. Tsura had outlined the simple plan. If the guards were taking shelter from the air raid, Seraph and Wolf would keep watch at the camp's perimeter. Marko and Tsura would run through the encampment, find their mother and Aunt Marie, and lead them to the car. Tsura inhaled the night air and prepared herself to witness the filth and illness. She dreaded to think how hungry her mother and aunt would be, if they're even there. As they walked toward the field of caravans, Tsura updated Wolf and Seraph about Kizzy. She was arrested. She was put on a truck with Jewish prisoners. What do you know about the roundups? We spent the weekend with our heads down, Wolf said. Our comrades will know more, Seraph told them. She looked at her boyfriend. The last of Germany's Jews are slated for mass deportation. When was Kizzy arrested? Wolf asked. At some point between Friday night and Saturday morning, Marko said. At Charité Hospital, Tsura added. Wolf nodded and ran his fingers across his short beard. There are holding centers for Jews across the city, but most prisoners are kept there for a day or two, no more. Then they're thrown onto the trains for the east. Wolf took in a deep breath and delivered the news Tsura had feared. Unless she found a way to escape, your cousin was deported to Poland. Unless Kizzy was brought to Rotspot's Marzahn, Marko suggested. The same idea had crossed Tsura's mind. It was improbable, but if the Gestapo had discovered Kizzy to be Romani, they might have sent her to the camp for Roma. Wolf shrugged. It's possible. Bombs fell in the distance, and Tsura pictured the prisoners of Marzahn cowering in their cabins, Kizzy among them. There could be a few hundred people. What do we do with them? Seraph asked. We tell them to run, Marko said. Wolf disagreed. That'll create a panic. Tsura shook her head. No, Marko's right. But whatever happens, we have to move quickly. Wolf and Tsura signaled to Seraph and Marko to duck behind the hedges. Seraph seemed unusually quiet. The chatterbox is lost for words. Nervous? Tsura asked her. I'm fine. Keeping their heads down, moving fast, the four ran along the side of the hedgerow toward the encampment. The air smelled of rotting waste. Seraph nudged Wolf. Is your stomach playing up again? She joked. Wolf brushed her away. The refuse dump is that way, and the cemetery is over there, Tsura said, pointing them out. The cemetery in one direction, the refuse site in the other, and the Marzahn encampment for her Roma family in between. Nobody could say the Nazis lack a sense of humor. Aunt Marie had once joked. Can I see? Marko asked, and snatched the binoculars from his sister's hand. Look, Marko said, handing the binoculars back to Tsura. Tsura peered through the lenses. Despite the sirens and explosions behind them, she could see a single guard with his back to them, close to the camp's edge. Marko tapped his knife. One guard. We can do this. Tsura pictured Mother asleep in her hut, close by. As a child, at bedtime, her parents would tell Tsura and Marko exciting Romani folk tales and sing old lullabies. Marko would fall asleep first, and Tsura would lie in bed listening to the comforting sound of her parents talking in the next room. Ready? Wolf said. Wolf was about to stand, but Tsura, with her binoculars covering her eyes, held out her arm. Wait, it's him. The police guard was the drunk from Friday night. Tsura was certain. Wim, she recalled. She remembered how Wim had walked her to the cemetery and ordered her to undress. He'd shown Tsura the photograph of his wife and young son. As before, Wim held a bottle of Brandwein in one hand, his rifle in the other. Tsura jumped to her feet. What are you doing? Marko asked. Marko's afraid for me. But Tsura knew what she was doing. She threw her binoculars at Seraph. Follow me, all of you, but stay far back, okay? The gun hidden behind her back, Tsura walked toward the encampment. She removed her hat and stuffed it in her pocket. As before, her dark hair fell below her shoulders. It's a lovely evening, she called out over distant blasts. Wim recognized Tsura again. Greta? He stepped forward, astonished to see her again. He laughed and looked up at the fighter jets in the eastern sky. Nice night for a stroll. Why are you out here? Tsura asked. Wim shrugged and lifted his bottle of Brandwein. The jar was almost empty. The man was wasted. They won't be bombing Marzahn. They're aiming for the city center. Wim told her. Tsura kept her gun out of sight. Where are the other guards? Hiding in Haupt's cabin, Wim said, gesturing to the caravans. Haupt. Tsura remembered that a high-ranking police official had been stationed at the encampment for a while. Too scared? Wim let out a laugh. Terrified. Not me. I'm bored. I'd rather be working at the protest. Anything's more interesting than this stinking hole. Tsura was confused. What protest? You haven't heard? Hundreds of people in the city. Normal Germans want the Gestapo to let their Jewish families go. Some of the trains to Poland have been put on hold. They've stopped the deportations? Tsura nearly shouted with surprise. She wondered what that meant for Kizzy. If the Jewish transports had been suspended, there was a chance Kizzy was still in Berlin. As the city shook from another blast, Tsura worried Kizzy would be hurt by a falling bomb or even killed. She looked up at the planes over the city. British? Could be. Or Soviets. What's the difference? The bombs are bad. Bad for Germany, bad for Hitler, bad for all of us. He staggered back, swigged his last drops of Bronfine, and dropped the bottle to the gravel ground. Are you here to see the cemetery again? No, I wanted to see you. Wim smiled and dropped his rifle, too. Kiss me, he said. She held him back. What about your wife? Staggering forward, reeking of alcohol, Wim fell onto her. My wife's not as beautiful as you. He slurred his words. His hands were around Tsura's waist, his drunken breath in her face. She allowed him to hold her. We could fall in love, he said. Her hand was on her gun, out of sight, her finger on the trigger. With her free hand, Tsura gripped his waist, pushing his hand away from her chest. Behind him in the distance, she could see Wolf and Seraph walking toward them. Soon you won't find me here, he said. You're being transferred? This camp is being closed down, Wim told her. He kissed Tsura's neck, his rifle by their feet. Tsura pulled back. Closed down? He started sending the prisoners away. It's already begun. When? This morning, Wim said. Then he paused. Why do you care? I'm here for my family, she admitted. Wim stared down and jumped back. Tsura pointed her pistol at his chest. Greta, no, please don't. Tsura kicked his rifle hard. It skidded fast and far along the ground out of his reach. Wolf, she shouted. Wolf, Seraph. Within seconds of her call, Seraph and Wolf were standing behind Wim, their arms outstretched, their guns aimed at his head. Wim raised his hands. No, please. I'm a father. I have 2 boys. Where's Marko? Tsura asked Seraph. No idea, Seraph said. Tsura didn't need to worry about her brother. He's always up to something. What's your plan? Wolf asked Tsura, his gun trained on Wim. They're clearing the camp. They started this morning, Tsura said against distant bomb blasts. She pushed away the possibility that her mother and aunt had been deported. Do you have the prisoners' names? Tsura shouted at Wim. Who have you sent away? Where are you sending them? Arms still in the air, Wim didn't reply. Answer her, Wolf shouted, and stepped forward with his gun. Wim's mouth its target. Wim gasped and stumbled. Poland, to Poland. I don't have the list. Tsura was untrusting of his every word. She prepared to shoot, but she had more questions. You said the deportations had stopped. Not all of them. Please, Greta, don't let them kill me. Her stomach flipped, and she thought of Kizzy. Has anyone been brought here? A young girl? 13 years old? I don't know, Wim said. But I can ask. Maybe there's a girl here. Want me to check? Tsura jolted her pistol forward, closer to his chest. Wim, tell me the truth. He stared at her gun. I haven't seen any girls brought here. Please don't shoot me. My children. I told them I'd see them soon. Tsura surveyed the campgrounds. Are there more guards inside? Wim was trembling now. In the commander's cabin, hiding from the bombs. If you're lying, we'll kill you, Wolf said. If there were no more questions left to ask. Wim was crying now. Tsura's wrist trembled as she focused on the trigger, begging to be pulled. She remembered the woman on the U-Bahn tracks, the screaming infant, and Samuel, her father, Professor Dewar dead in the morgue, Kizzy, Aunt Marie, Mama. As bombs fell over the city behind her, Tsura ran toward the encampment. Her eyes searched the area for Marko, but he was nowhere to be seen. "Where's my brother?" she called out to Wolf and Seraph. "Just be quick," Wolf shouted back. As she ran, Tsura put her hat back on. Her boots sank into the muddy pathway that led into the barren field. The hut stood silent in the black of the night. She knew this place, and her feet carried her fast toward the towering trees at the rear of the encampment where she had once lived. The washing line outside the familiar caravan was empty and broken. She climbed the wooden steps and pushed open the door. "Mama?" Inside, a damp stench of excrement hung in the air. The caravan was empty. Tsura ran from vacant caravan to vacant caravan. They're gone. When she noticed a figure, a woman, disappearing into a doorway, Tsura's chest heaved with hope. "Wait!" Tsura reached the hut and climbed the steps. She peered through the door, and faces stared back at her. 4 women and 3 children huddled on the beds and dirt floor with terrified stares. The air was rancid. "I'm looking for my mother, Jael Lang, and Marie Lang, my aunt." One woman's eyes glowed with acknowledgement. "They are Romani?" she asked. "Yes." These women were Sinti, Tsura gathered. Romani and Sinti families had been imprisoned together, just as Tsura had been sterilized along with 3 Sinti girls. "We know them. Your mother and aunt were here," another woman added, "but they were taken hours ago. Marie was very ill. Jael wanted to go with her. She insisted." Tsura ignored the swelling of discomfort in her chest. "What about Kizzy Lang? She's Marie's daughter, 13. She would have been brought here at some point in the last few days." The women shook their heads. "Only deportations. There's been nobody new." The pain in Tsura's chest grew outward, surging through her throat and down into her stomach. Despite the stench of the hut, she inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the burning reality. "I'm too late." Her mother and Aunt Marie were gone. Words masked in anger fell from Tsura's mouth. "They took my family, but you're still here. Why didn't they take you? Who?" Tsura's question was cut off by a dog's bark and muffled chatter outside. Guards. The air raid siren had stopped. "I can't be seen." "Officer Haupt," one of the women whispered, and they cowered against one another. Pulling a blanket out from underneath one of the children, Tsura wrapped herself in it as if wearing a shawl. Her coat and hat were covered, her face exposed. She fell to the floor in front of one of the women, who let out a small gasp. As the caravan door opened, Tsura pushed her shoulders backward, pushing the woman against the wall and blocking her from sight. The blinding beam of a soldier's flashlight filled the space, drawing Tsura's attention to the squalor of the cramped living conditions. Tsura's pulse raced, and the women and children said nothing as a soldier counted them. Then he closed the door, and the room was swallowed by shadows once more. Tsura stayed still. She waited a while before standing. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the woman she had smothered, and she returned the blanket to the shaken child. When the door swung open again, Tsura almost screamed. She threw herself against the wall. "Tsura," Wolf whispered into the darkness. "I'm here. Get inside," she said. The women and children glared with fear as Wolf stepped into the caravan. "Come on, Tsura, we have to go," Wolf whispered. "The guards." Tsura addressed the women. "Come with us." Wolf took hold of Tsura's wrist. "Are you crazy?" "We have to try." Tsura signaled for the women and their children to stand. One woman shook her head. "They'll beat us again. They'll ruin our daughters." "That dog is trained to kill," another woman said. "The government is sending you away, east. We can help you. Please trust us." Marzan meant only death. "But where would we go? This is our home." "It's okay." "Tsura, no, it's impossible." She ignored Wolf's protest. "Come with us. Don't be afraid," she said to the children. "You mustn't listen to her," the women said to their little ones. "It's too dangerous." A distant gunshot marked the end of their debate. "Hurry," Wolf said, his hands now pulling at Tsura's shoulder. Outside, there were no guards in sight. The dog's faint bark signaled their opportunity to run. Tsura left the prisoners behind and followed Wolf through the camp. As they approached the boundary of the field, Wolf gasped and broke into a sprint. "Seraph!" When Tsura caught up to them, she saw what Wolf had seen. Seraph was standing, gun in her hand. Wim was on the ground, face down in the gravel and dirt, motionless. "What did you do?" Wolf shouted at Seraph. Wim was dead. Shouts and the barking dog echoed behind them through the night air. Tsura turned to see 3 soldiers moving between the huts in the distance. At that very moment, the air raid siren began to wail again, and the soldiers disappeared, returning to their hiding place. "We have to leave here." The air raid siren whirled, as if crying for the dead man at Seraph's feet. Then Wolf turned around and let out a yelp, breaking Tsura's daze. Seraph was startled too, and she spun in place, pointing her gun at something behind Tsura while Wolf stumbled backward. When Tsura turned, a face returned her stare. A man in uniform she didn't recognize. A Nazi officer, her father's age. He'd been standing behind her, helmet and rifle, his sober eyes laughing, preparing to shoot. Tsura's gun was in her pocket. She held her breath, expecting the Nazi's gunshot. "Drop it!" a voice shouted. Another face appeared from the shadows, unshaven, dark hair. Marko. Tsura couldn't breathe out. She took in more air. Marko's hand and knife reached forward, his blade at the Nazi's throat. The officer dropped his rifle to the ground and Tsura could finally exhale. Tsura reached for her gun, training it at the Nazi officer as Marko stepped away from him. Seraph moved position and pointed her gun at the Nazi too, while Wolf, gun in hand, surveyed the area. "What are you kids doing here?" the Nazi asked. His voice was harsh. Wolf edged forward. "Shut up." Marko stared at his sister, unsmiling. "I saw him earlier. I followed him." He was no longer Tsura's baby brother. Marko's short, dark beard contrasted with his pale skin. "My brother saved my life." "Mama, Aunt Marie, they're not here, Marko." Her voice trailed off. "What? You're sure? How do you know?" Marko's voice cracked. His stone face drained of all color. Tsura strained to say the words. "They were taken this morning. We were too late." She turned to the officer. "Your officer, Haupt." Haupt was responsible for the cap, and for the deportations, most likely. "I'm not," he said. "You're lying. Tell us what you know about the deportations," Wolf demanded. The Nazi looked toward the fighter jets over Berlin. "Why do you even care about these Zigeuner? The transports will resume in the morning as planned, with or without me." Before Tsura could respond, Sarah fired 2 shots, and the officer fell to the ground, his eyes open to the skies. Marko yelped in surprise. "Why? Why, Seraph? Why did you do that?" Wolf shouted. "He told us what we needed to know," Seraph said, her voice cold. She paused. "I did it for my parents." Wolf kicked at the ground. Then he began to scream, a painful sound. Seraph had stolen his chance to kill. Wolf's cry faded into more explosions in the distance. Tsura couldn't take her eyes from Wim. He was face down, arms by his side, his right ankle twisted inward, fingers open. These men weren't the only people to die tonight. Moving quickly, Seraph picked up the rifles of the dead men and began to search through their pockets. Keys, crumpled banknotes, cigarettes. Seraph kept what was valuable and discarded the rest. Tsura watched the photograph of Wim's family flip over in a light gust of wind. "Help me," Seraph said to Wolf as she unbuttoned the Nazi officer's jacket, but Wolf just gawked. He was silent now, while the air raid siren continued to cry. Marko helped Seraph strip the Nazi down to his long underwear and undervest. Seraph crouched over the corpse, clutching the blood-stained uniform, trousers, jacket, boots, and army cap. Tsura picked up the officer's identity card. He wasn't Officer Haupt. He'd been telling the truth. Wolf kicked Wim's body twice, hard, and then spat on the almost naked officer, as if killing them was not enough, as if his spit would make it so he was the one who had pulled the trigger. When Seraph reached up for Wolf's hand, he stepped away from her and ran toward the stolen car. Behind Wolf, Tsura walked fast in front of Marko and Seraph. Seraph carried the Nazi uniform and guns. "I'll sell them, or smuggle them," she told Marko. Marko said nothing. "Want one?" Seraph asked. Tsura turned back to see her offering Marko a rifle. "Go on, you earned it," Seraph said to him. But Marko shook his head and gestured to the knife in his pocket. Tsura was tired of Seraph's chatter. "Stop talking, please," she snapped. With a huff, Seraph walked ahead of them. As more bombs fell on the city, Tsura synchronized her steps with her brothers. They moved fast together. Mud was caked onto their boots, evidence of Tsura's failed plan. As the planes flew above the city, Tsura implored the British to win this war. "What now?" Marko asked her, his voice defeated. Tsura choked on her anger, then swallowed it down, forcing her rage into the pit of her stomach, hidden. Their mother and aunt had been deported. Nothing could be done. Kizzy hadn't been brought to Marzan, but some of the trains had been halted. When the air raid is over, back to the city. Kizzy might be there. Marko squinted, as if trying to understand what his sister was saying. Alex, too, Tsura said. What? Her brother's face lit up. There's a demonstration. People are protesting for the release of the Jews. Are you serious? That's what Wim said. Wim? The guard. His name was Wilhelm. When they reached the car, Wolf was sitting in the passenger seat. Seraph dropped the folded Nazi uniform and weapons onto his lap and took her place behind the wheel. She held out the binoculars for Tsura to take. I don't want them, Tsura said. She didn't need them anymore. The thunderous explosions in the distance were beginning to sound ordinary. Jael Lang. Marie Lang. Marko was about to climb into the back seat when Tsura held out her arm to stop him. Then she tapped Seraph hard on the shoulder. Move. Marko will drive us. Alexander. When Noah built his ark and gathered the animals inside, his neighbors laughed. But as the rain began to fall, the men and women who had been given a chance to escape the impending flood panicked. If only they'd listened to crazy old Noah. If only they'd planned their escape. As the bombs fell, Alex knew how Noah's neighbors must have felt. The train that Alex and Marko should have taken out of the city was long gone. Perhaps Marko had caught it. Alex imagined him safe, already out of Germany. Noah collected the animals 2 by 2. Would Marko have boarded our train without me? With the exception of a short pause, the siren and bombs had been constant. The Nazi guards had allowed Simon and the other Jewish orderlies to leave. But before the Gestapo cowards had fled to their bomb shelters, they'd locked the hundreds of prisoners inside the building. Alex and his father were trapped. Alex sat with his arms on his knees, chin on his hands. Taking his mind away from the bombs, Alex wondered what Marko would think to see him unshaven like this. Marko would have liked it, he was sure. For the first time since Alex arrived at the community center, Rosenstrasse, from one end of the street to the other, was empty. Even those who had been holding vigil each night had scurried away when the siren began to cry. The protest was over now. We'll be deported, as planned. As each bomb fell, the building shook. The room lit up as bright as daylight whenever a firebomb hit. They were in the heart of it, and the men jumped and shouted. The light and noise were spectacular. They could hear the women screaming from downstairs. Leah's father was scared for her, while Mr. Lessel, father's colleague, mentioned the children in the room below. Some of the men around Alex cried out in anger against their captors. Some recited aloud Hebrew prayers, asking God to forgive them. As if we should be repenting, Alex wanted to say to them. The conditions in the community center were worsening. The toilets were now blocked and overflowing. It was hard to get used to the putrid smell. Now, instead, they were using buckets inside closets. It was becoming harder to find somewhere to sleep. Some of them, Alex and the other teenagers, slept sitting up against the walls. The whistling of a bomb so close to the building made many of the men scream even before it hit. Then the firebomb landed on the street, rocking the building and illuminating the room. One man began to recite the Kaddish, the Jewish mourner's prayer for those who had already been killed that night. His praying reminded Alex of their first tragedy, earlier. An old man on the 4th floor, they had heard, died of a heart attack. And there were rumors of some people considering suicide. As the bombs fell, Father covered his face. I can't stop thinking about Ruthie and your mother, he said. They'll be okay, Alex reassured him. His thoughts led him to Marko, hoping he was safe. Another firebomb landed so close to the building that the windows rattled. Leah's father hid his head in his coat. They were all afraid of the glass blowing in. The man reciting the Kaddish prayer began to repeat it. The melody was familiar, taking Alex to a memory from his childhood. At age 7, soon after his father had remarried, Alex stood at the grave of his paternal grandmother. Father struggled to pronounce the strange Hebrew words, and the rabbi instructed him to rip his shirt. Later, Alex had asked Father about the ritual of mourning. It was a Jewish custom, Father had said. By ripping their clothes, they accepted something that had been forever broken, forcing the loss to sink in. Alex remembered his grandmother in the hospital days before she died. Alex had asked if he could rip his clothes too. Grandchildren were not permitted to mourn, the rabbi had said. But at home, in the privacy of his room, Alex had torn his shirt and cried face down on his bed. Another bomb hit, and Alex hoped Mother and Ruthie were safe. He imagined they were terrified, cowering from the bombs in their basement. Alex remembered Ruthie's treasure hunt. He wondered if she'd followed all the clues to find her gift and its accompanying message written in white chalk. He smiled for a moment as he pictured Ruthie finding her final clue, leading her to the hidden porcelain train. Mr. Lessel was writing in his diary again. He appeared to be taking a tally of the blasts. As the bombs fell, he didn't jump or shout. He continued to write. "This is the end of the protest," Mr. Fetterman proclaimed. "If only the British knew about the protests. If only the British knew about the protesters." Father smiled. "It's the day of the Luftwaffe. They chose today especially, I bet. Today was a festival marking the strength of the Nazi Air Force. The protest will end, but the bombs are sending a message to Hitler's immoral government. The end of the war is on the way." Another blast rocked the building, and Father laughed. The war could end within hours. Some of the praying men repeated Father's words as an imploration to God. "Let the war end, even if we all die," one man cried. When an explosion illuminated every corner of their prison, Alex for the first time noticed the mezuzah, the ancient Hebrew scroll on the doorpost of their room. The ancient Hebrews, slaves to Pharaoh, marked their doorposts with the blood of a lamb so that God would take notice and ensure the 10th and final plague, the murder of the firstborns of Egypt, would not enter. I'm a firstborn. He wondered if God would notice the mezuzah, too. Alex crawled over to Mr. Lessel, the diary keeper. "Can I have some paper? Your pencil?" At first, Mr. Lessel scowled at Alex, as if he'd interrupted his greatest work. Then he smiled and carefully ripped out a handful of blank pages from the back of his notebook and pulled out another pencil from his pocket. "Keep it," Mr. Lessel said. "Thank you." As two bombs fell in the adjacent street, the room glowed bright. Alex's hand moved, and as if the words were escaping his fingertips, he began to write to Marko a poem, even though Marko would never read it. Each time he heard the crash of a building, the smash of bricks, glass, concrete, Alex was inspired to write more words, another line. He'd find something to tie his note to, one of his boots maybe, and he'd throw it from the window. Marko would find it, after the bombs, a message that Alex was still in Berlin. Alex finished the note and folded the remaining blank pages into the pocket of his coat. More bombs fell, and explosions lit up the room. Then Alex scoffed at his ridiculous idea. As if Marko could find the note in all the rubble on the streets. He stuffed the note into his trouser pocket. Another bomb crashed close by, and Alex imagined Marko aboard his ark. Noah's drowning neighbors screaming while Hitler's capital burned. Alex hoped to God that Marko, Mother, and Ruthie were all safe. Ruth. "The bombs are fireworks," Ruth told herself, screeching and rocketing through the night. She was sitting on Mama's lap, and Elise gripped her arm. Even though they hadn't talked much over the last few days, Ruth was so grateful that Elise Edelhoff was her best friend. Ruth was terrified for Alexander and Papa, and having Elise next to her, outside the Jewish Community Center, and here in Ruth's neighbor's basement, had helped a lot. Ruth's mind kept jumping to Alexander's girlfriend, the girl he'd planned to meet at midnight on Friday, the girl he'd been talking to Marko about. Elise saw them kissing. Alexander had kept his girlfriend a secret, but Ruth didn't know why. She'd overheard Alexander say her name, but Ruth couldn't remember it now. Ruth hoped Alexander's girlfriend was safe for her brother's sake. She wondered if his girlfriend knew Alexander had been arrested. Even in the middle of the air raid, or because of it, Elise and Ruth were back to their old selves, rolling their eyes at each other and trying to keep each other upbeat. The first few minutes of the bombings had been dreadful. Mrs. Edelhoff had grabbed Elise's arm so tight that Elise had screeched at her in pain. The whistling and crashing of bombs had been unbearable. Then Elise's horrible neighbor, Mrs. Unruh, the impolite woman with her baby and 3 annoying sons, had started opening her mouth, cursing the British and the Soviets and the Americans for trying to destroy the fatherland. The woman was a Nazi, and proud of it. "She needs to shut up," Elise whispered. There were 15 people in the basement, all squeezed inside, adults sharing seats, children sitting on their parents' laps. The reinforced metal roof hung not far from their heads. Mrs. Edelhoff held her hands over her ears, trying to drown out the noise. Not sounds of the bombs, Ruth laughed to herself, but of Mrs. Unruh's remarks. Mrs. Unruh's 3-year-old kept running around the already cramped basement, kicking everyone in the shins with his heavy shoes. His mother, holding his baby brother, said nothing, leaving it up to everyone else to calm him down. "He's driving me crazy," Mrs. Edelhoff kept muttering under her breath. "I was awarded the Medal of Motherhood," Mrs. Unruh announced. Against the racket of the siren and bombs, Ruth adjusted her glasses and put her mouth to Elise's ear, trying not to laugh. "They gave the cow an award?" Papa had told Ruth about the special medal. In their frightening wisdom, the Nazis had invented a medal to encourage German women to bear more children. If any German Aryan woman gave birth to 4 children, she received the honor. The children were needed to replace the soldiers killed on the front lines, Papa once told Ruth, only half joking. Then he'd half joked that soon Hitler would be sending 10-year-old Aryan boys to battle with toy helmets and real guns. "I hope our house isn't hit, or the medal would be destroyed," Mrs. Unruh said. "If we survive the cow and her awful children, we'll all deserve medals," Ruth whispered. Elise let out a loud laugh, and the awful woman gawked and pouted at the girls disapprovingly. Embarrassed and amused that she'd been caught, Ruth couldn't help but smile before looking away. Despite the explosions, Ruth felt strangely chipper. Attending the protest each day had filled Ruth with hope that Alexander and Papa would be released, and she hoped they and other prisoners had been allowed to take shelter from the bombs. After the British air raids last year and last month, Jews had been forbidden from entering the city's specially built air raid shelters, so Ruth couldn't imagine the Nazis evacuating the community center. In her head, Ruth listed all the people she knew across the city, her teachers, friends at school, neighbors, familiar shopkeepers, Mama's friends at church. She thought about her brother's friend Marko and his young cousin. Kizzy had never made it to their house. Ruth and her mother had been at the protest every day, so there was a chance Kizzy had shown up when they were out. But she would have left a note, Mama had said. Ruth said a prayer that Kizzy, Franziska, was safe. Then she said a prayer for Papa and Alexander. Remembering the 2 small photographs of Alexander she found beneath her bed, Ruth reached into her coat pocket. She ran her fingers along their edges. Seeing her brother's face made Ruth scared for him, and she wished she hadn't looked. Ruth placed them back inside her pocket, along with Alexander's treasure hunt clues. As more bombs fell, Ruth recited the riddles she hadn't yet solved. The hidden rose, the woman's place of birth. Ruth didn't know what they meant. She'd been going over and over them in her head. She turned to whisper in Mama's ear. "I said a prayer for Alexander and Papa." "Me too," Mama said. "It's rude to whisper," Mrs. Unruh snapped. Ruth shot the woman a look to mind her own business. Awful woman. Papa would have called the woman a hypocrite, and worse. Mama put her mouth to Ruth's ear. "Pay no attention. I've known her for years. She's trouble." A bomb hit hard, closer than any of the others, and everyone screamed. Elise's nicer neighbors had been sitting with their eyes closed the whole time. Mrs. Unruh continued her commentary. "They're trying to hit the Gestapo's headquarters and important landmarks. The British and the Communists can go to hell. I hope their planes fall out of the sky." Then Mrs. Unruh addressed Ruth's mother. "Where's your husband?" as if she didn't already know. Over the siren, Ruth couldn't help but provide an answer. "My father and brother are being detained. They're at the Jewish Community Center." Ruth placed emphasis on the word Jewish. Ruth knew what the woman had been getting at. She's a Jew hater and an idiot. Not a good combination. "My husband is stationed in France. He just received another promotion," Mrs. Unruh boasted. Mama nodded knowingly. "So, he's a Nazi pig?" Ruth asked. Elise gawked at Ruth. Mrs. Edelhoff gave Ruth a critical stare, and Mama nudged Ruth in the ribs, but Ruth knew Mama agreed. "You need to control your daughter," Mrs. Unruh screamed. Mama replied calmly. "She's 15. She's allowed to speak her own mind." Ruth smiled. Then the Nazi woman clicked her tongue and looked away. Then she snapped her neck around again and looked right at Ruth. "Well, what can you expect from the daughter of a whore?" The people in the basement, including Elise, gasped. Ruth felt mortified. Everyone knew that Ruth's mother hadn't been married when Ruth was born. Mama had never talked about it, but Ruth knew Mama was ashamed of the fact. Ruth stared at the cow, wishing she'd take back the remark. Ruth wanted to claw at her eyes. It was people like her, Papa had told Ruth once, that made him ashamed to be a German. Elise gave Ruth an uncomfortable smile. Elise's father was fighting in Hitler's war just like the woman's husband, but there was an enormous difference between fighting on the Eastern Front, risking your life, and being a high-ranking Nazi stationed in France. When another bomb exploded nearby, they all closed their eyes and covered their ears. Then the sky was silent. Only the siren wailed. They sat there speechless, waiting for the sound of more fighter planes. They could smell smoke. That was the last bomb. As the siren continued, Mrs. Unruh chattered away. "Well, I'm sorry to hear about your husband and stepson," she spoke in a mocking tone. "She's glad they've been detained. She'd have Mama and me arrested too, given the chance." A feeling of pride surged from Ruth's stomach to her throat. "We've been going to the protest every day, and the government's listening." "The protests will need to stop now there's been an air raid," Mrs. Unruh said, looking at Mama. Mama sneered. "Oh, I have no intention of staying home. We'll be heading back to Rosenstrasse as soon as the sun is up, and we'll keep returning until they release every Jew." For the first time, Ruth believed it. The siren stopped. A veil had been lifted off the city. They could breathe again. Mama hugged Ruth tight of congratulations that they'd survived the bombing. At first, nobody moved, waiting for the all-clear. With a ringing in Ruth's ears, she sensed that everyone across Berlin was feeling the same relief at the same moment. But the wailing of the siren was replaced by distant screaming. Ruth tried not to imagine how many people had been buried and killed by the crashing buildings. Again, she prayed that Papa and Alexander were safe. Maybe they found a way to escape. Ruth followed Mama up the basement stairs. Outside, people emerged from their homes. Some were crying. Many people were coughing from the smoke and fumes of burning rubber. The air was thick with gray smoke. "Will you join us at the protest tomorrow?" Mama asked Mrs. Edelhoff as they walked into Elise's house. Elise's mother shook her head. "Not after the bombs," she said, and took herself to the living room. "You'll join us, right?" Ruth asked Elise. "I have to go to school. I'm sorry," Elise said. Mama chuckled. "I'm sure school will be canceled. We'll pick you up after breakfast." "Good night." Ruth hugged her best friend tight, thankful they were unharmed. Ruth felt bad for Elise, with a mother like that. Mama led Ruth outside. Elise's street had been almost untouched by the bombs. The clouds of smoke along with screaming were coming from the next street down. As Ruth and her mother walked toward their home, the wails became louder. They turned the corner to see a pile of bricks and charred wood. The view was unrecognizable. Whole buildings gone. Women, men, and children walked over the glass that covered the pavement. Cats, domesticated pets, now strays, climbed and whimpered through the rubble. Mama took hold of Ruth's hand as they watched smoke pouring into the sky. The pavement was orange from the glow of flames that burned through a half-standing house. Two boys around Ruth's age ran and shouted through the wandering survivors. "It's even worse that way," one boy reported, pointing east. "St. Hedwig's Cathedral was hit," the other boy said. Ruth held her hand to her mouth. "Our church. Father von Wegberg," Mama said with a gasp. Ruth remembered hearing how, after the first serious anti-Jewish violence, a year before the war had begun, Father von Wegberg had defied Hitler and encouraged his congregation to pray for the Jews of Germany. His decision to speak out led Mama to attend confession at St. Hedwig's. Ruth remembered her confession the day before her birthday. Father von Wegberg had been so patient with Ruth's childish jokes. She pictured him sitting behind the lattice of the confession box as the cathedral burned around him. Ruth's morbid thoughts were interrupted by the sight of an old man, on his knees, screaming on the road. As they approached, Ruth saw he was bent over a woman's charred body. His wife. She was dead. Ruth stared as the man howled. By the time they reached their neighborhood, Ruth's glasses were covered in dust. "We should expect the worst," Mama said. As they turned onto their street, Ruth breathed a sigh of relief to see the rows of houses still standing. Some of their neighbors were outside assessing the damage. At first their home looked normal, but then, through the broken front windows, Ruth saw how its entire back had been blown out. A direct hit. Mama said nothing. "Oh, God," Ruth whispered. They walked around whole pieces of roof and wall that had been blown into the road. Other buildings were on fire. Behind the facade of their home were piles of rubble, smoke rising from the ground. The sight of their basement exposed to the night sky made Ruth gasp. "We would have been in there." Ruth gasped again at what had been the house next door. "They must have been killed," Mama said. "We were saved tonight," Ruth said, gripping Mama's hand. Ruth's mother said nothing, wiping away the soot and tears with her sleeve. If Ruth hadn't seen Elise's rose-colored coat and rushed into her house, if Ruth hadn't overreacted and got herself upset over not finding Alexander's clue, then they wouldn't have stayed for dinner. They would have come home instead. Ruth stared at the rubble and ashes at the space that, just over an hour ago, had been her family's home. They were lucky to be alive. Mama wiped away tears. We'll get through this. Objects are meaningless. My treasure hunt! Ruth yelled. Alexander's remaining clues were gone, along with his gift. Ruth had promised herself everything would be okay. Papa and Alexander would be saved if she figured out Alexander's puzzles. When Mama reached into her coat pocket and handed Ruth a folded piece of paper, Ruth felt the urge to cry. Ruthie, here. Your brother gave this to me. I was supposed to give it to you when you asked me for it. Like the other clues, Ruthie was written along the top. Mama's name, Annette, was written in larger handwriting in the center. Ruth read the puzzle to herself. Find Mickey. The clue was from part of the treasure hunt that would have led Ruth to the mouse hole. Alexander had intended for Ruth to be repulsed by this riddle. Instead, Ruth felt a twinge of happiness, as if her brother were there with her. She wanted to walk to Rosenstrasse. She wanted to see if Papa and Alexander were okay. A sudden crash made Ruth jump. A burning house, 4 doors down, fell and crumbled to the ground. Ruth and her mother gasped and jumped back as more dust and smoke filled the air. Ruth's glasses were thick with soot. She could barely see, so she took them off. Who was my father? The question fell out of Ruth's mouth. Immediately, Ruth wished she hadn't asked. Ruth could tell Mama wanted to respond, but something was stopping her. It's okay, Ruth said, giving her mother permission to say anything or nothing. Mama nodded and took in a breath. Ruth breathed in, too, the smell of burning filling her head. You were my birthday present, in a way, Mama said, as if giving confession. A birthday present? It was my 19th birthday, June 1928. I went out for dinner with my friends from university, then a wine bar in the city. Mama paused, and with the inside of her sleeve she wiped the toxic smoke from her eyes. I met a young man. He was an American in his early 20s. Was he my father? Mama paused, then nodded. At the time, selling alcohol wasn't allowed in the United States. The American was in Germany to drink for cheap. He spoke a little German. I spoke some English. I took him back to my friend's apartment. We threw him a party and we all drank too much. Mama was smiling as she talked. In the morning, I woke up next to him. He was still asleep and I crept out. A few weeks later, I remember it was in the middle of the Amsterdam Olympics. I realized I was pregnant. I've always meant to tell you all of this. At first, Ruth didn't know what to say. She'd thought about her biological father from time to time. She'd asked Mama about him before, and Mama had promised to tell Ruth everything one day. With her glasses in her hand, without them on her face, hearing the truth, Ruth felt suddenly older. She looked through the remaining wall of their destroyed house. What did your family say? Ruth asked. Ruth's mother laughed. Your grandparents were mortified, but eventually they calmed down. They kept it a secret for months until the bumps started to show. I was the talk of the neighborhood. Annette isn't married. How can she have a baby? That's what they said. Martha Unruh, her name was Martha Peterson back then, was an old school friend of mine. Martha was always horrible, even as a girl. Mama's face filled with a grin and she squeezed Ruth's arm. But you were my gift. The day you were born, it was such a sunny morning. It was the happiest moment of my life. You arrived a little early, which gave the doctors a scare, but you were healthy and perfect. Mama's words made Ruth smile. Does Papa know all this? And Alexander? Papa knows everything, of course. Alexander has never asked. What did he look like? Ruth asked, wanting to know if she resembled the American. He was nice looking. Brown hair, fair skin, medium height. I never saw him again. All I know is that he lived in New York. Oh, and he was Catholic, too. I'm half American, Ruth said, and stared at the hot rubble. The British did this, with the help of President Roosevelt. With her grimy glasses in her fist and her face and clothes covered in soot, Ruth walked beside her mother through the burning streets, back to Elise's home. The American. What was his name? Ruth asked. William. That's all I know. As they walked, another question appeared in Ruth's throat, as if it had been stuck there, waiting to be discovered. Where was Alexander's mother born? His first mother? In Dresden, Mama replied. Ruth wondered if Alexander's biological mother was the her of the unsolved riddle. Dresden could have been the answer to one of the missing clues, but the rest of the treasure hunt, along with Ruth's birthday prize, had been destroyed. Elise. Ruth always gets her way. Please, can you wear it? Ruth asked Elise. Tired from a poor night's sleep, Elise was holding out her Girls' League uniform. She should be grateful. Ruth's clothes were covered in soot, and everything else had been burned, so she needed to borrow something. But Ruth was refusing to wear Elise's uniform. I don't have anything else for you. Your coat will cover it, Elise said. Elise knew Ruth would feel uncomfortable wearing the League jacket, whether it was hidden or not. I'm being horrible. But Elise couldn't help herself. Elise wasn't happy having to attend the Girls' League. She hated having to spend her time learning about German motherhood. When Victor was in the hospital, Elise had wanted to quit the meetings. She'd worried that the other girls would find out about her defective brother. But she'd heard rumors about those who stopped attending, identified as traitors. After Victor died, Elise wondered what the League leaders would do if they knew that her dead brother had been mentally disturbed. Every time she wore the uniform, Elise thought about that. Elise gave in and passed Ruth a dress and a thick sweater. Over her stockings, Elise put on her Girls' League climbing jacket and skirt, covering them up with her warm old overcoat and scarf. She thought about the soldier on Rosenstrasse. Maybe I'll unbutton the top of my coat so he'll see my uniform underneath. Last night in the basement, Elise had admitted to her mother that she was frightened, and Mother had whispered in her bitter way that this was war. As the bombs fell, Victor had been with them the whole time. He wasn't afraid, and he said everything would be fine. But he was talking to Ruth. If Elise hadn't offered to cook for Ruth and her mother, they would have gone home earlier. Ruth and her mother would have been dead, crushed by their house. Parts of Berlin, especially near Elise's home, were devastated. The settling dust blurred the morning light as Ruth, Mrs. Broden, and Elise walked by destroyed buildings. Bricks and glass covered the streets, and some structures were still smoldering. 4 girls Elise's age in their League uniforms were talking to the injured and homeless. They walked together in their matching berets, just like the one in Elise's pocket, in their black neckerchiefs and brown climbing jackets. They were helping the poor people of Berlin. That's what a good German would do, they'd been told. Good Germans. Hundreds had died. Hundreds of good Germans, and hundreds, maybe thousands, had been injured. Victor walked behind Elise, staring at the rubble and the girls in their uniforms. You think I'm one of them? Elise whispered to him. Victor looked down at his bare feet, as if embarrassed that Elise knew what he was thinking. Pardon? Ruth asked. Nothing. Elise was mortified. Ruth had heard her speak to Victor. Ruth and Mrs. Broden had stayed over last night. When they'd returned late in the evening, Elise's mother had caught a fright, wondering who was knocking at the door. Thieves, she'd guessed. Gypsies taking advantage of the air raid, trying to find some helpless women and children to steal from. Maybe Jews like rats trying to scurry away, Mother had said. When Ruth and Mrs. Broden said their house had been bombed, Elise's mother was surprisingly kind to them. Misery loves company, Elise's father would have said. Elise had given Ruth a clean nightgown to wear. Ruth had slept on the mattress on Elise's bedroom floor, while Mrs. Broden had slept on the couch downstairs. In bed, Ruth had kept going on about feeling scared for her father and Alex. But God had a plan for them, Ruth had reassured herself. God ignored my family, Elise had wanted to tell her. Mother had prayed for Victor every day. Elise's father had taken them to church almost every week, but still Victor had died. Falling asleep, Elise had been glad Ruth's house had been bombed. Victor had stared at his sister from the corner of her bedroom. The morning wind threw dust in their faces. As they arrived on Rosenstrasse, Elise shielded her eyes with the sleeve of her coat. Oh no! Mrs. Broden screamed at the sight of the debris on the road. A building had collapsed into the street. On the opposite side, the Jewish community center was still standing with the crowd outside. Thank God, Ruth said. A protest was still going on, it seemed. The same Nazi police guards stood outside the entrance. The center hasn't been damaged. Everyone is still in there, a woman told Mrs. Broden. Ruth's mother rushed over to a group of women to find out what they knew. Elise wished they were at school. I can't expect they still won't let them go, Ruth said to Elise. What did she expect? Ruth was almost in tears, as if a little air raid would have persuaded the Nazis to surrender. Nothing will persuade Hitler. Nothing. When Elise's parents had received a letter stating Victor had died of typhus, Elise's father had cried in his bedroom for days. Mother wouldn't allow Elise to comfort him. They were sent Victor's ashes, and a small, sad funeral was arranged. People visited to watch them grieve. Ruth and her family invited Elise and her parents for meals and popped in with lunch baskets at the weekends or cakes in the afternoons. Alex invented all sorts of quizzes and games and riddles, trying to take Elise's mind off Victor. Elise's father went back to work. At home, they didn't talk about Victor's death. But the worst news was yet to come. It was summertime, a weekend. A few months later, a married couple came to their door. Their daughter, Cicely, had been at the same mental facility as Victor, they said. They were both 9 years old. Victor and Cicely had the same illness. Victor's mind hadn't progressed beyond that of a 5-year-old. Cicely acted as if she were 3. Elise's father invited the couple in for coffee. Father should have sent Elise upstairs, away from the conversation, but she sat on his lap. The couple told them Cicely was dead too. And there were others, they said, other children who died. And adults. There'd been an outbreak of typhus, Father clarified, but the couple explained how each death, each child, each adult, had died from different causes all around the same time. There was something wrong with Cicely's death certificate. The doctors had killed their daughter, they believed. That's when Mother screamed at them to get out. She called them liars. Elise's father tried to calm her, but Mother kept yelling. Elise's father saw them to the door. Weeks later, one evening after dinner, Elise's father announced he'd spoken to the couple again. Cicely's parents were telling the truth. He had spoken to the relatives of other dead patients from the hospital. Elise sat quietly at the kitchen table, listening to the horrific news, while Mother shuffled in her chair. Doctors and nurses employed by the Nazi government were killing people who were deaf or blind, Father explained. The crippled, the epileptic, the schizophrenic, and the retarded. The doctor had been covering up the killings with death certificates stating how each patient had died of typhus, or a heart defect, or some other disease or infection. Victor had been murdered. In Girls' League, Elise had learned about the useless eaters, the sick people who wasted government resources and precious food. Earlier in 1939, when Hitler's government had encouraged parents to bring their ill children to special facilities, Elise's mother didn't hesitate. Victor was damaged, Mother had explained. She said it was as if Victor couldn't be fixed, as if he should have been thrown away. Look! Ruth was pointing at the debris from the bombed-out building across the street. Protesters were scaling the rubble, attempting to see into the community center. They're trying to look through the windows. Let's climb up. She thinks this will end well. Ruth was still hopeful about Alex and Mr. Broden. Just as Father had been hopeful the hospital would cure Victor of his mental condition. Elise scowled at Ruth. Elise knew better. People thought the air raids would force the Gestapo to change its policies. But the British had bombed Germany before, and those buildings hadn't changed a thing. Ruth had reached the bottom of the debris. Elise stared at a young man standing on the highest point of the rubble. Ruth, Elise said, not moving. Ruth turned and pulled on Elise's arm. Elise, come on. Elise was frozen in place. That's him, from the market. Right in front of them, on top of the debris, stood the scruffy young man from Hackeshire Market, the man who said Elise had saved him, the young man with the knife. He had a short beard now. Without thinking, Elise waved, and he looked back at Elise with the same handsome smile, his face creasing at the sides of his eyes and mouth. Elise was smiling too. Her heart raced. Ruth gasped. It's Paul! Ruthie Broden? He shouted. Elise was stunned and baffled that they knew each other. His name is Paul? Elise said nothing, just repeating his name. Paul, Paul, in her head. Alexander's here, Ruth called out to him, pointing to the center. What? Paul's eyes widened and he leapt down the side of the rubble right up to Ruth. Your brother's here? Are you sure? Paul and Alex are friends. Elise was amazed at the coincidence. My father's here too, Ruth said. She spoke extremely fast. They're arresting all the Jews left in Berlin. We're protesting and we've been... Is Broden okay? Paul asked, interrupting her. Yes, I mean, we don't know. I hope so. Ruthie, it's so great to see you, he said, and put his arms around her, squeezing Ruth tight and lifting her off the ground. Elise waited for Paul to throw his arms around her like that. She waited for him to thank her again for saving him in the market. She waited for Paul to tell Ruth how Elise had helped him, how he would have been stabbed by that African boy if Elise hadn't intervened. This is my friend Elise. Elise, this is Paul. He works with Alexander at the factory. Paul and Alex work together? This was too strange. Elise beamed at Paul, delighted to see him again. Nice to meet you, he said. Elise could feel her face turn bright red. He doesn't recognize me. She waited for Paul to figure it out. She wanted to remind him of how he knew her. We ran together through Hackasher Market. We escaped the thief and took his knife. Not wanting to embarrass herself, Elise smiled politely as Paul continued to chatter away to Ruth. He has no idea who I am. To Paul, Elise was just a silly little girl. Marko. Thinking about Alex, knowing he was so close, made Marko feel dizzy, like drinking Dur's vodka. In Marzahn, learning the news that his mother had been deported to Poland, Marko had felt entirely defeated. But now, with the news that Alex was here, Marko felt strong again. You sure he's in there? He asked Ruthie again. She saw him, Ruthie said, nodding at her friend. Ruthie's friend pointed. In that window. Marko felt determined to find a way into the building, to climb the walls, smash the windows. I'll smash every Nazi guard. At Marzahn, he had held the knife against the officer's neck, except this time he told himself, I'll have the guts to cut their throats. The air raid. Our house was bombed, Ruthie blurted out. What? Marko pictured Alex's dining room, the hallway, and Alex's bedroom, all ash. Marko didn't tell Ruthie he'd been there the night before. I could have been killed. Our whole house was destroyed. At least you're still here. Marko grinned and planted a light punch on Ruthie's shoulder. Ruth smiled, sadly. I know. Wait here, Marko said, and headed into the crowd. Where are you going? Ruthie called out, but he kept walking. Nazis stood in line in front of the community center, black metal helmets, uniforms, keeping the crowd back in rows like Nazi flags hanging from the buildings. Marko wanted to hang the bastards. Most of them weren't much older than him. Some might have been good-looking if it hadn't been for their swastika medals. The crowd was growing. Children and men, but mostly women. One woman held a screaming baby. Nazis swarmed the area. Marko chose a spot against the open gate of a courtyard and kept his eyes on the guards, looking for a way to get inside. He made a plan in his head to kick open a window, crawl up a drain pipe, climb in through the roof. He'd find Alex and get him out. They'd run back to Seraph's place, take some food and Alex's map book. Tsura and Wolf would organize false papers for Alex. Then they'd take a train headed west, just as they'd planned. Leaving Berlin had been Alex's idea. While Marko had been the first man, the first person Alex had ever kissed, Marko was different. Before he met Alex, he'd kissed a couple of girls and a dozen men, but Alex was better than all of them. Alex had arranged for him and Marko to go out on deliveries together. They'd worked diligently and fast, so they could leave work early. That way, they had more time together. Marko told Alex about the laws against homosexuals. Perverts, the Nazis called them. Alex knew a little about all that. The law had been written decades before Hitler came along. They were breaking the law, and they had to protect their jobs and themselves. They had to keep their relationship a secret from their families. When Marko told Alex about men like them being sent to the Nazi labor camps, Alex became scared. More than ever, Marko wanted to escape Berlin. Knowing Tsura could help, Marko told her that he wanted to leave Germany. Tsura had called Marko selfish. He'd be abandoning Kizzy, she said, but Marko had argued that he'd had to leave before he was sent to fight Hitler's war. Risking death for the Nazis, the oppressors of their people, Marko put it in Tsura's words, wasn't something he was prepared to do. Finally, Tsura agreed. When Marko asked her to help his Jewish friend Alex as well, Tsura had agreed to obtain false papers for Alex and 2 train tickets. Protesting for Alex's release, standing in the middle of a demonstration felt strange. People are speaking out. Marko had been born in 1926. He could hardly remember what Germany had been like before Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. Standing close to the crowd made Marko want to be a part of the revolution, to do something. He continued to plot his way into the building, but he couldn't get close. Too many guards. For a moment, he had the crazy idea of going up to the Nazis and telling them he was Romani to get himself arrested, just to be with Alex. Since Marzahn, Marko had been thinking nothing good would happen. Tsura had allowed Marko to drive, as if it was some prize. But the car journey back to the city had been horrible. Marko had wanted to scream. His mother was gone. Seraph had talked about her parents, locked up in different Nazi camps, while Tsura and Wolf said nothing. All four of them, 2 women, 2 men, all young Germans, were lost in the middle of a horrific war. His hands on the wheel, Marko had stared at Berlin's burning streets. They'd gone to Marzahn too late. At Seraph's apartment, they'd gulped down mouthfuls of schnapps. Seraph had sat on Wolf's lap and raised a toast. To the dead Nazis, she said, proud of herself. Wolf had refused to drink to them. He pushed Seraph off and went to bed. Wolf was right. Celebrating their deaths was pointless. Wolf's family was still gone, Marko's too, and Seraph had headed to the sink to rinse off the drying blood from the dead Nazi jacket, then followed Wolf to their room. Tsura slept on the sofa. Marko fell asleep on the floor, thinking about his mother, picturing her, black and gray hair, soft skin, mauve dress, and gray hat, on a train heading deeper into the Nazis' hell. Marko pushed through the crowd on Rosenstrasse to find Ruth again. Ruth waved Marko over. She was nicely put together, with neat hair and a braid that stuck out of her hat. Her friend was a mess, with spotty skin and broken hair. "Where have you been?" Ruth asked. Marko jumped over her question. "Any chance you've seen a little girl? My cousin? She was arrested?" Ruth gasped. "Franziska? That's why she didn't show up." Marko described her. She's 13, dark hair. She's skinny, probably wearing a brown coat that's too big for her, and a blue hat. Ruthie shook her head. "Sorry, doesn't—" "In the window," Ruthie's friend interrupted. "A few days ago, I saw someone. A girl." Marko took in a sharp breath. "Which window?" Ruthie's friend pointed. "There. She was probably about 13. She had a blue knitted hat and dark frizzy hair." "That's her!" Marko's heart beat faster, thinking about Kizzy in the building. "With Broden." He looked around at the huge crowd. The protesters, mostly women, stood watching the windows of the building, determined. With hundreds on the street, Alex and Kizzy wouldn't be going anywhere. The guards in their helmets stared back. Marko's eyes searched for Tsura. He grinned at Ruti. "I can't believe I ran into you. Wait till my sister hears all this." Kizzy. "I'm not a yellow star," Kizzy wanted to tell the officers. But the Nazi continued to shout, "Dirty Jews." The younger kids were crying. The officer's dog was black and brown and showed its sharp teeth while pulling on its leash. "Downstairs," the Nazi snapped at the Jewish orderly. "Where are they taking us?" Esther asked. "How should I know?" Kizzy said. "I don't even know where we are right now." Tsura's words rang in Kizzy's head. "If a Nazi wants to take you somewhere, just run." "We've got to get out," Kizzy said to Felix and Esther. Felix stared at Kizzy. He seemed too scared to talk. "Where would we go?" Esther asked. Ari, Esther's 4-year-old cousin, with hair as red as fire, didn't let go of Esther's sleeve. "If we run and Ari's with us, he'll slow us down." The guards would notice his hair. They'd be caught immediately. "Ari can't come," Kizzy said to Esther. "But we have to stay together," Esther protested. "Fine with me," Kizzy said. Fewer people, easier to hide. The orderly led the children into the corridor. Kizzy pulled down her hat, tight on her head. The doors along the hallway were open. The other rooms were empty, as if the whole building was being emptied. As the Jewish children walked aimlessly, slowly, steadily behind the orderly, Kizzy glanced back at the empty corridor. There were no Nazi guards. The orderly was up ahead of the group, Kizzy at the back. For a moment, the Jewish orderly turned around to look at them. A teenager who was obviously upset by the younger kids who were crying. "It'll be all right," he told them, and looked at the older children in a sad way. "Let's go," Kizzy whispered to Felix. Felix tugged on Esther's arm. "Come with us." Esther hesitated and then looked at her cousin. "I can't leave him alone. He's only 4. Then Esther slowed down. "Are you coming or not?" Kizzy whispered at her. With Felix right behind her, Kizzy rushed down the hallway to the door at the end. "Esther!" Felix called out in a spoken whisper. "Be quiet," Kizzy said. The orderly watched them. Kizzy wondered if he would sound an alarm, but then he turned around, walking Esther, her cousin, and the other kids away. He let me and Felix run. The door took them into some kind of storage room with shelves full of what looked like folded sheets, with mops and brooms leaning against the walls. The strong odor of chemicals and fresh paint hung in the air. There was more than enough space for them to hide, at least for a few minutes, while Kizzy could think through her next steps. Kizzy and Felix stepped inside, and before closing the door, Kizzy checked that the handle would open from the inside. It could. It was pitch black now. They couldn't see each other. "They'll find us," Felix said. "Will you shut up?" Kizzy snapped. But Felix was right. In the darkness, Kizzy reached along the shelves, feeling around carefully for something to hide them. Her fingers touched tin boxes of bristles, paintbrushes, and a stack of rags and sheets, painter's sheets, folded in neat piles. There were loads of them. Careful not to knock anything over, Kizzy took 2 sheets from the shelf. She let one sheet fall open and then touched its edges and corners to figure out its size. "It's big enough." "Here, get in the corner and cover yourself," she whispered, and passed Felix a sheet. "Make yourself look like a box or something, and stay completely still." Felix followed Kizzy's instructions. She could hear him get onto the floor, shuffling into the corner and covering himself with the sheet. In the pitch black, Kizzy ran her hands along the floor, making sure his feet weren't sticking out. Then she crouched on the floor, too, right next to Felix, and covered herself with the other sheet, trying to make herself as small as possible. She tucked her pinafore dress beneath her shoes and sat down with her back against the wall. The cold of the floor seeped through her stockings. She rested her elbows on her knees and put her arms over her head to change her shape. The strong smell of paint filled her head, and she could hear Felix breathing lightly. She could hear footsteps in the corridor outside. "No breathing sounds," she whispered. Nazi guards would be searching for them. When the door handle rattled, Kizzy held her breath, hoping to hell Felix didn't move, hoping it wasn't obvious they were there. Suddenly, through the material, there was light. The storage room was open. "We'd been caught." Then it went dark. They didn't see us. "Kizzy? Felix?" It was Esther speaking too loudly. "Shh! They're all gone," Esther said through the darkness. Kizzy pulled the sheet off her head, staring into the pitch black. "This part of the building is empty now," Esther said. Kizzy wanted to ask Esther about Ari. She was surprised she'd left her little cousin alone, though it was the right thing to do. But there was no time for chatter. The soldiers would be checking their lists. "We gotta find a better place to hide." "Let's go," Kizzy said. Standing up in the darkness, Kizzy could hear Esther stepping to the side. Kizzy moved to the door and opened it carefully. Squinting at the bright light, she looked out into the hallway. Esther was right. There was nobody around. She could hear voices coming from downstairs. She stepped into the corridor. When she turned to tell Felix and Esther to follow her, she saw Ari, the 4-year-old, with his fire-red hair and his yellow star, his hands gripping Esther's skirt. "What's he doing here? We can't take him. He's a baby." Esther looked right at Kizzy, her eyes pleading, saying nothing. In the darkness, Kizzy hadn't seen Ari. "He's too young, but he knows how to stay silent," Kizzy admitted to herself. "Fine." Kizzy scowled at the little boy. "But you've got to be good." Ari nodded. He seemed scared of Kizzy. She would have laughed if she weren't so angry with Esther. As they passed the rooms along the corridor, Kizzy checked each one. They were all empty and led to nowhere. Close to the stairwell, she heard voices coming from the lower floor. The only option was up. Felix led the way to the stairs, but Kizzy remembered when she'd reached the top floor of Charité Hospital and couldn't escape the building. "There's a way out of here, but it's not up." "Felix, no, come back down." Felix listened to Kizzy's whispered instructions. Kizzy noticed a metal grate at the end of the corridor. "Stay here and keep watch," she told him. Leading Esther and her little cousin to the other end of the hallway, right up to a vent close to the floor, Kizzy saw it was covered by a metal grate that had rusted along its edges. Kizzy pulled at the bars. They were loose, but the corners were screwed into the wall. "Something sharp," Kizzy said out loud. "Professor Dewar's key." Kizzy got onto her knees, her stockings against the hard floor. She pulled out the key, using it to turn one of the screws in the corner of the grate. "It's working." The screw dropped to the floor, and Kizzy started the next. The second screw wouldn't turn, so she tried the third, but it was also stuck. Tapping of shoes on the hard floor made Kizzy look up. Felix was running toward them. He said nothing, but his eyes were bulging and told them there were soldiers coming up the stairs. "I need to run." For a split second, Kizzy planned to leave Felix, Esther, and Ari in the hallway. They'll be discovered, but I'll have time to hide. But rather than deserting them, Kizzy lifted little Ari off his feet. To keep him calm, Kizzy made a shushing sound in his ear. Esther and Felix followed them into one of the rooms along the corridor. Kizzy ran straight to the corner, to a cupboard. Swinging open its door, she was hit by a stench. There was no time to pause, and the four of them squeezed into the makeshift toilet. Felix moaned at the smell. Esther covered her mouth and nose with her hands. Kizzy continued to hold Ari tight, his feet off the ground and around her waist. He started to whimper. "Shh, it's okay. You've got to stay quiet. We're going to play a hiding game, okay? Shh, shh." Kizzy remembered the professor at nighttime when Kizzy would wake up from a bad dream. The professor would sit on the edge of Kizzy's bed, stroking her hair. Ari calmed and held Kizzy tight. Standing between Felix and Esther, the full toilet bucket by her feet, Kizzy listened for the sound of soldiers in the hallway outside, expecting the Nazis to discover them. "Good boy," Kizzy whispered. Felix in the room made Esther throw her back to the wall, which made Felix flinch. His leg banged against the toilet bucket. When she felt the wet, cold human waste splash from the bucket onto her stockings and shoes, Kizzy wanted to scream. Instead, she focused on getting away. "If they catch me, they'll send me to Rastplatz, Marzahn." As much as Kizzy wanted to see her family, being sent to Marzahn would be terrible. Marko had told Kizzy once that Marzahn was a one-way ticket to the grave. Her horrible cousin had made her cry. The voices on the other side of the cupboard door disappeared. Kizzy and the children stood in silence for at least 5 minutes. Soon, Kizzy's arms were throbbing from holding Ari for so long. Felix and Esther were waiting for her to decide what to do. "I'm putting you down," Kizzy whispered, and lowered Ari carefully to the floor. Esther took his hand, and Kizzy opened the door just a crack. The room was empty. The building was silent. "Stay right here," Kizzy told them, and they gave Kizzy a look, as if furious she was forcing them to stay in the nasty cupboard for longer, or scared she was leaving them all alone. "I'll be back for you, I promise." Kizzy walked over to the barb-covered window. She could see out to the trees across the street. The window muffled most of the noise, but she could hear shouting from below. Gestapo officers and guards yelled for people to get into a truck. Jews, women, and men cried, holding onto each other. She watched the guards beating the crowds of Jews with horsewhips. Climbing out of the truck, the people screamed. The guard held out his arm, signaling for the people in the queue to wait. Another guard slammed the truck's door and it drove away. In every direction, the road was completely empty. It was broad daylight, but there were no witnesses to these deportations. Only a pretty cobblestone road, lined with trees on the opposite side. Another truck pulled up and the Nazis pointed for the men and women to climb. 40 or 50 people in coats and suits and shirts and floral skirts and blue dresses and gray scarves and yellow stars. Then Kizzy saw the Jewish children, the little ones from their room. Some were crying like they'd cried when the bombs fell last night. Some were held by adults, perhaps their parents, probably strangers. The Nazis lifted the littlest ones, almost throwing them inside the waiting trucks. Kizzy felt an urge to turn back to Felix and Esther and the little boy in the toilet cupboard. She wanted to make them look. They should see this, see what's happening to their people. But the sight would have terrified them, and they were already so scared.